Some stories don't begin with light. They begin in silence, in places where hope is just a memory and healing seems like a myth. But sometimes, in the most forgotten corners of the world, a quiet bond is formed between two broken souls. This is not just a tale about a dog and a man. It's about survival, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be found when no one is looking for you. As Victor Hugo once said, even the darkest night will end and the sun will rise. Stay with us until the end, because the lesson waiting there might just change how you see the world. The wind howled across the open plains of Colorado, carrying with it the scent of pine, rust, and the faint bitterness of something forgotten. Just past the edge of town, where the roads thinned and the land stretched quiet beneath a gray winter sky, there stood a rescue shelter, a place more rust than roof, where the dogs no one wanted were sent to wait. Not for love, not for a home, just for time to pass, until someone made a decision. It was the kind of place people didn't talk about, fenced off with dented wire. The gate creaked when it moved, as if complaining with every gust. Inside, the concrete kennels echoed not with barking, but with silence. The younger dogs had long since been adopted, the loud ones too. All that remained were the tired ones, the ones with scars you could see and others you couldn't. In the farthest corner of the shelter, under the weak flicker of a single bulb, lay a gray Pitbull cage 62. He didn't pace like the others. He didn't lift his head when someone walked by. His body, broad and muscled under matted fur, bore the signs of a life hard-lived. A tear split one ear down the middle. His back leg trembled slightly, favoring a limp. His ribs, though not protruding, whispered of meals skipped. But it was his eyes that stopped people cold, not because they were wild or frightened, but because they were empty. Quiet, like he'd already accepted no one was coming, that whatever hope he'd once clung to had slipped away long ago. Most people walked right past. A volunteer had once tried calling him Buddy, but the name had floated past him like air. They gave up after a week. His tag simply read, Cage 62, male, mixed breed. History, unknown. That morning, the sky hung low, a flat sheet of steel. It was on that cold, colorless day that Miles Thorne pulled into the gravel lot outside the shelter. His truck coughed as he shut it off, the engine reluctant in the chill. Miles wasn't supposed to be here. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned to do much of anything. The trip into town was for supplies, nothing more. But somewhere between the hardware store and the dirt road turnoff, his hands had taken the wheel a different direction. He told himself it was curiosity, maybe even guilt. But the truth settled heavier than that. He hadn't stepped foot in an animal shelter since the day they buried his wife and daughter. It had been 8 years since the collapse, the bridge that failed during the flood, the rescue that came too late, the pain that didn't. Since then, Miles had built a life made of silence, a small wooden cabin tucked into the hills. No phone, no TV, just the hum of tools. In a barn that never really finished being built. The neighbors stopped calling years ago, and he let them. But something about today, it felt different. A tug, soft but persistent, pulling him through the door of a place he had no business being. The shelter smelled of bleach and wet concrete. A young woman at the desk looked up. Surprised, "You here for a dog?" she asked. Miles just nodded, unsure why he didn't turn around. Rows of cages lined both sides of the dim hallway. A few dogs barked, others wagged tails against the steel bars, but Miles barely noticed. His feet moved before his thoughts did, leading him to the very last kennel on the left, the one in the shadow of a broken overhead lamp. That's when he saw him, Cage 62. The dog didn't move, didn't even blink. For a moment, Miles thought he was asleep, but then those eyes lifted, just barely, and in that fraction of a second, something passed between them. Not affection, not curiosity, recognition. Pain recognizing pain. Miles felt it like a punch. He stared, the air suddenly heavier in his lungs. The dog didn't whimper, didn't crawl forward. He just looked, as if to say, "I know that silence you carry. I live with it too. A minute passed, then another. Miles exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping like he'd been holding something too long. "Can I see this one?" he asked the volunteer quietly. She raised an eyebrow. "You sure? He's not the friendliest. Doesn't really do much." Miles nodded again. "I'm not looking for friendly." The kennel door creaked open. The pit bull didn't move at first. Then, with effort that seemed more mental than physical, he rose to his feet. No growl. No tail wag. He simply walked out and stood next to Miles, like he'd done it before, maybe in another life. Outside, the sky cracked open with a flurry of snow. Miles opened the passenger door to his truck. The pit bull paused, gave one look toward the field beyond the shelter, then climbed in without a sound. Miles sat behind the wheel. His hands trembled slightly. He looked over at the dog curled in silence beside him. "Didn't expect this today," he muttered. But as the truck rumbled to life and rolled away from the forgotten shelter, something unexpected bloomed in the quiet between them. Neither of them had come to be saved. And yet, somehow, they'd found each other anyway. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as Miles pulled into the long, uneven driveway. The cabin came into view, slowly, wood darkened by years of wind and weather. Its windows shuttered, porch half sunk in shadow. It wasn't much, but it was his. A place forgotten by most, tucked high in the Colorado hills, where trees stood like quiet sentinels, and silence came as natural as breath. The truck engine sputtered off, and for a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. Miles glanced down at the pit bull still curled on the floorboard. No sound, no shift, not even a flick of the tail. Just that same stillness, the kind that had nothing to do with rest and everything to do with waiting. Waiting for something bad to happen, or for nothing at all. "Come on," Miles said quietly. The dog didn't need coaxing. He stepped out with the same deliberate motion he had at the shelter. No sniffing the ground, no excited rush to explore, just calm, practiced obedience. Like the path from truck to porch had been etched in his memory years ago. Inside the cabin, the air held the faint smell of old cedar and dust. A wood stove in the corner still glowed faintly from the morning fire, and boots lined up neatly by the door told of a man who lived alone but with order. Miles pointed to the blanket he'd laid out beside the fireplace. "That's yours!" The dog glanced once, then slowly circled down onto it. Not curled in comfort, curled in defense. Eyes open, watching the room like a soldier, guarding unknown territory. Miles stood in the kitchen, hand resting on the counter, just watching him. "Don't suppose you're hungry?" No reaction. He filled a bowl with water, cracked open a can of dog food, and set both nearby. The dog barely sniffed it before turning his head away. All day, that was the rhythm. Miles worked outside repairing a broken gate, occasionally glancing back through the window. The dog never moved, not toward the food, not toward the door, just waited. That night, the sky darkened early. Snow tapped softly against the roof. Miles tossed another log on the fire and lowered himself onto the couch. With a worn book he didn't plan to read, he didn't expect to sleep. He rarely did, and when he did, it came in waves, uneven, uneasy. The dreams always returned, the sound of rushing water, screams under falling steel, his daughter's laugh, then silence. Sometime after midnight, with flames crackling low and snow drifting past the window, Miles dozed off. The dream came swiftly. A collapse, the groan of metal, a woman's voice shouting his name, then the dog, his old rescue partner, Duke, whining, blood soaking the sand beneath them, staying by his side until the medics came. The same name he hadn't spoken in years echoed through the darkness. Blitz. He woke with a jolt, breathing hard, heart pounding in his throat. Silence. Then, from across the room, a sound so small he almost missed it. A shift. He looked up. The pit bull, still nameless, had lifted his head, ears perked, eyes locked on Miles. Not startled, not afraid, just alert, present. As if the name had struck something inside him. Blitz, Miles whispered again, more to test himself than the dog. The Pitbull's head tilted slightly, his ears twitched, the way a memory might stir inside a mind not ready to remember. Miles sat upright, hand over his chest. That name, Blitz. He hadn't spoken it since the funeral. It was the name his daughter had given their family's first rescue dog, the one who saved people in floods and fires, the one who died when the bridge collapsed. The Pitbull blinked slowly and lowered his head again, resting it on his front paws. He didn't move after that, but he also didn't look away. Miles didn't say another word. Somehow, it felt like enough. Over the next few days, they lived side by side in a strange quiet. Miles went about his routines, feeding chickens, repairing tools, splitting wood. The dog followed, not close, but never far, always just in view, always watching, always silent. He didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, but he stood beside Miles every morning as the coffee brewed, lay near the barn as the snow fell, and settled on the blanket beside the fire each evening as the house grew still again. They never spoke, but they didn't have to. There was something in the air between them, a mutual understanding that neither of them was whole, that maybe they weren't meant to fix each other, just exist in the same space where the world didn't expect anything anymore. Miles started calling him Blitz. At first, just casually, a test. Then with more intention. The dog didn't respond with excitement, no tail thumping, no sudden recognition, but each time the name left Miles's lips, the Pitbull's ears twitched, just slightly, like the sound was carving a path through something broken deep inside. One night, as the wind howled louder and the sky poured thick with snow, Miles fell asleep in his chair. The fire was dying, and his dreams were soft, this time no screams, no rushing water, just the sound of quiet breathing. When he opened his eyes an hour later, the dog was still there, lying just a few feet away, this time facing him, watching him sleep. And for the first time in a long time, Miles didn't feel alone. In the dark, the snow came heavier that week, blanketing the hills in silence. Most days, the sky wore a flat gray tone, and the trees stood still like they were listening. Miles had lived alone long enough to know what normal looked like in a house like his. The creaks in the wood, the way wind wrapped around the porch, the smell of pine when the stove kicked in. Normal was predictable. But this dog was not normal. Blitz didn't act like other rescue dogs Miles had seen. He didn't sniff every corner of the cabin, didn't bark at wildlife rustling in the woods, didn't dig through trash or chase squirrels. He didn't play, and he certainly didn't beg. Instead, he patrolled every evening. Just after the last embers in the fire dimmed, Blitz would rise slowly from his blanket and begin his rounds. Not aimlessly, not out of boredom, but with quiet intention. He moved from room to room, nose low, steps deliberate. He would stop near each window, linger near doors, pause near the back of the kitchen like he was checking for something like he'd done it before. In another life, it was subtle at first, but by the fourth night, Miles couldn't ignore it anymore. He sat in the corner with his coffee, watching the Pitbull glide through the house like a shadow on a mission. It wasn't just instinct, it was training. Miles found himself gripping his mug tighter than usual. There was something about the dog's movements efficient, silent, methodical, that made the hairs on his arms rise. This wasn't a stray who had been abused. This wasn't a backyard fighter or a neglected house pet. This was something else. One morning, just before sunrise, Miles knelt beside Blitz while he rested on the blanket. His fingers grazed the dog's neck, brushing against the old leather collar that had come with him from the shelter. It was frayed at the edges, stained with time and wear. He hadn't thought to take it off before, but now he needed to know more. He unclipped the buckle carefully, holding it under the light. The leather was double-stitched in some parts, uneven in others. One side felt thicker than the rest. He pinched it gently, then slid a pocket knife under the seam. A few careful cuts revealed something hidden in the lining. A chip, embedded, old, and nearly unreadable beneath dust and dried glue. "What the hell?" he whispered. By noon, he was back in his truck, Blitz in the passenger seat this time. Miles drove the winding road down toward the edge of town, where a small wooden sign barely visible through the snowfall read, Dr. Linda Emerson, DVM Ret, by appointment only. The cabin was nestled between two frozen pastures, surrounded by wind chimes and rusted wind sculptures. A few sheep wandered nearby, their breath visible in the crisp air. Miles stepped out and knocked gently. Linda opened the door after a moment. Mid-60s, wiry gray braid, eyes like weathered stone. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. People like her didn't work in town clinics. They lived out here because they understood broken things better than most. You remember me? Miles asked. She gave him a faint smile. You helped fix my fence 5 summers ago? That old red truck of yours still runs. Barely. Got a favor to ask. He lifted Blitz's collar and the chip he'd removed. Linda's eyes narrowed. Come in. Inside, the smell of herbs and cedar filled the small room. Animals lounged across mismatched rugs, cats with 3 legs, a blind goat, an old Labrador with a clouded gaze. It felt more like a sanctuary than a home. Linda took the chip to the back, rummaging through a dusty drawer for an old handheld scanner. Don't get your hopes up, she said. These old ones rarely give anything clear, especially if someone tried to hide it. Miles sat down, Blitz curled by his feet. He hadn't moved since entering, just watched. Always watched. The scanner beeped once, then paused. Then again, Linda frowned. It's not a standard registry. Looks military adjacent, but off-grid. She typed something into an old laptop. The screen flickered, slow and green. A minute passed, then 2. Finally, a name appeared. Name, Titan, breed, American Pitbull Terrier, gray, ID, classified internal asset, status, recovery failed, handler presumed deceased, ownership, private contracted, clearance level restricted. Linda exhaled slowly. Well, she said, that's something. Miles stared at the screen. Titan. He looked down at the dog, who stared back with steady, unblinking eyes, as if he already knew what the screen would say. There's not much here, Linda continued. But this line, recovery failed. It means he belonged to someone who didn't come back. Miles leaned closer. Private contracted. Means not government issued. Could be a special operations unit. A disaster recovery force. Even a private security firm. But the fact it's marked classified and hidden, someone didn't want this dog found. She sat beside him, her voice softer now. You know, my son served Army medic. Afghanistan. Didn't come home either. Miles nodded once. The silence stretched. Sometimes, she added, the only thing left of them is what they trained, what they loved. He swallowed hard. Blitz Titan rested his head on Miles's boot. They didn't speak again on the way home, but something had shifted. A curtain pulled back, just enough to see what lay behind it. Not just a dog, but a ghost, a survivor. And whatever past this animal had come from, it hadn't let go of him. Now, Miles wasn't sure it ever would. The night began like every other. The fire had burned down to its final embers. Outside, the cold pressed against the cabin walls like a quiet warning, wrapping the forest in frost and fog. Miles sat at the kitchen table, flipping slowly through the worn pages of a manual he wasn't really reading, the room lit by the soft amber glow of an old oil lamp. Blitz was curled on his blanket by the door, silent as ever, his breath steady, his eyes half-lidded but never fully asleep. Miles had gotten used to that, the way Blitz always seemed half-aware, like a soldier still on rotation, waiting for the next command that might never come. But tonight, something shifted. It started as a low sound, not a bark, not even a growl, just a rumble, deep and vibrating from Blitz's chest, like a drum roll beneath the earth. Miles looked up instantly. The dog was on his feet now, body stiff, ears forward, hackles raised. He wasn't just alert. He was warning. What is it? Miles asked, rising from his chair. Blitz padded silently to the front window, his eyes locked on the tree line just beyond the porch. Miles followed, parting the curtain with cautious fingers. At first, All he saw was the darkness fog curling between the pines, snow gathering on the grass, then headlights. Dim. Still. A vehicle sat just beyond the fence line, motionless in the mist. It was a black SUV, windows tinted, lights off now, engine purring like a distant growl. Miles squinted. There were no license plates, no markings. Just the shape of something that didn't belong, sitting too quietly in a place too remote. And then, as if aware it had been seen, the SUV began to back away slowly, gravel crunching under its tires until it disappeared into the forest road without ever turning its headlights on. Blitz didn't stop watching for a long time. Neither did Miles. That night, neither of them slept. At first light, Miles walked the property line. Tracks from the SUV were still visible in the snow crisp. Recent, they led down the private road, out past the tree line, and vanished near the edge of a frozen creek. Whoever had come, they hadn't meant to be seen, or maybe they had. Back at the cabin, Miles made coffee with shaking hands. Blitz sat near the door, unmoving, but his eyes never left the window. The thought came quickly. Without invitation. This wasn't random. By late morning, Miles discovered the back door lock had been scratched subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But he'd spent enough of his life working with rescue crews and engineering teams to know what a forced latch looked like. He entered the house slowly, heart pounding. Nothing was missing. Not his tools, not the hunting rifle in the hallway, not even the emergency cash stashed in the floorboards. But something was gone. Blitz's old collar, the one Miles had taken off after finding the chip, and the folded medical report Linda had printed the day before. Both had been in the drawer by the door. Now they were nowhere to be found. That was the moment the fear turned to fury. Miles sat down heavily at the table and reached for the landline he hadn't used in over a year. It rang twice. Clara. A pause. Then, a voice that carried equal parts warmth and curiosity. Miles Thorne. Now, there's a name I haven't heard since you pulled me out of that warehouse fire. Wish I was calling for a favor, he said. But it's not for me. It's about a dog. Go on. He told her everything: the shelter, the collar, the chip, the name Titan, the patrol-like behavior, the hidden SUV, and now the break-in. Clara didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was only silence on the line. Then, that name you found, Titan, it rang a bell. Give me 24 hours. Miles hung up and watched Blitz, who was now pacing the house again, slow and steady like a sentry returning to post. By the following night, Clara had answers. Her voice was sharper now, not surprised, just burdened. You're not wrong, Miles. Titan was part of a privately contracted response unit. The name of the operation was Vanguard 8, officially dissolved 5 years ago after a mission went south in southern Colombia. It was supposed to be a joint effort with local authorities during a mudslide evacuation. Miles leaned forward. Supposed to, yeah, she said. But there were inconsistencies, civilian casualties, equipment buried. Half the team didn't make it out. And the ones who did, most went dark. The unit was absorbed into a shell company and vanished from federal records. And the dog, according to an internal memo I found buried on a whistleblower board, one K9 asset was marked recovery, failed. That would have been Titan. Miles rubbed his temple. Who was his handler? She hesitated, then said softly, Aiden Cross, former Army Ranger turned contractor, highly decorated. Last seen boarding the mission chopper. The explosion happened during extraction. He was declared killed in action. No remains. None. Miles glanced down at Blitz, who lay by the fire again, ears twitching at every creak. So if Cross didn't die, then someone might not want him or that dog found. Clara said, and whoever showed up at your fence line, they weren't just curious. The room grew quiet, the fire popping gently in the background. Miles stared into the flames, jaw tight. Someone had come looking, not for him, for Blitz. Not to help, but to erase. And the only question left was, why now? Winter deepened its hold on the hills. The snow came heavier, more persistent, clinging to the trees like frostbitten memories. At night, the winds howled harder, seeping through the gaps in the old cabin walls. Miles had begun locking every door, every window, every latch. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. The kind of instinct that only comes from feeling watched. Ever since the black SUV and the break-in, Miles moved differently. He no longer wandered far from the house. He started carrying a flashlight in his pocket, and a crowbar now rested by the front door. But the most noticeable change was Blitz. The Pitbull no longer slept by the fire. He slept in Miles's bedroom, at the foot of the bed. It had started without words just one night, after the sound of distant tires rolling across gravel had stirred Miles awake. Blitz had padded quietly into the room and lay down with a sigh. After that, it became routine. There were no commands, no permission asked or given. They simply understood there would be no more distance between them. And it turned out that change came just in time. The snow fell fast that Thursday evening, blurring the landscape into shapes of gray and white. Miles had spent the day sealing the barn windows and restocking wood inside the cabin. Blitz had watched him from the porch, eyes constantly scanning the woods. That night, the world outside disappeared into a storm of silence. Just down the hill, Ray Branson, 76 years old, lit a small pile of leaves near the back of his garden. He'd always been stubborn that way, insisting on doing chores himself, even as his knees grew brittle and his hands trembled slightly from age. Miles had offered to help that morning, but Ray just chuckled and waved him off. "I'm not dead yet," he'd said with a wink. At 9:15, Miles dozed off in the armchair near the fire. Blitz was already curled on the rug in his room. The door cracked just enough to hear the wind outside. At 9:42, everything changed. A sudden growl shattered the silence. Not a soft alert, a sharp, guttural warning that made Miles's eyes snap open. "Blitz?" he called, rising fast. The growl rose into a bark louder, desperate, not for threat, but alarm. Then came the crash. Blitz had thrown himself at the side door. The screen exploded off its hinges. By the time Miles got outside, flashlight shaking in his hand, Blitz was already gone, vanished into the snowy dark, his tracks swallowed almost instantly by the wind. "Blitz!" Miles shouted, his voice raw. No response. He followed the direction the dog had gone down the slope, through the trees, past the fence line that separated his property from Ray's. The snow came up to his shins, the cold slicing through his jeans. His boots slipped on the icy patches, breath fogging in great bursts. Then he heard it barking, fast and sharp, ahead near the garden shed behind Ray's house. Miles rounded the corner, light sweeping the ground. That's when he saw them. Ray was lying in the snow, half crumpled near a collapsed chair, his breath shallow and eyes fluttering. Blitz stood over him, barking, pawing at the old man's chest, licking his face in fast, frantic motions. The snow had begun to crust over Ray's jacket, his lips pale with cold. "Ray!" Miles dropped to his knees, checked for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady. "Hang on, old man." He dialed 911 with frozen fingers, giving clipped instructions to the operator, voice tight with urgency. The dispatcher promised help within 10 minutes. Blitz didn't leave Ray's side. He whimpered low now, not in panic but in persistence, like he was begging him to hang on. Miles took off his coat and wrapped it around Ray's torso, using his own body as a shield against the snow. Blitz crawled closer, pressing himself into the old man's side like a living heat pack. By the time the paramedics arrived, Ray's breath was still shallow, but he was alive. Hypothermia, but stable. One of them said, "You got to him just in time." Miles didn't answer. He just looked at Blitz, whose chest rose and fell slowly now, his eyes still locked on the stretcher as they lifted Ray toward the ambulance. The next morning, Miles brought Blitz to the hospital's rear entrance. They weren't allowed inside, but word had already spread. A nurse came out smiling, eyes misty. "He's awake," she said. "And he keeps asking for the dog." Ray was propped up in bed, bundled in blankets. Fourth, drip in his arm. When he saw Blitz walk through the doorframe, his eyes welled instantly. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the one who found me." Miles stood to the side, saying nothing. Ray reached out a trembling hand. Blitz moved forward without hesitation and placed his head gently into the man's palm. "You saved my life, didn't you?" Ray said softly. "I'm still breathing because of you, kid." Blitz didn't bark, didn't wag. He just stood still and let himself be touched. Later, as they left the hospital, a local reporter caught them outside. She asked for a photo, anything for the paper. Ray smiled through his cracked lips and said, "Tell them it wasn't just a dog. It was a guardian, a second chance wrapped in fur." Miles didn't speak much the rest of the ride home, but that night, as Blitz lay by the fire again, Miles reached down, ruffled his ears, and murmured, "That's twice now you've pulled someone back from the edge." Blitz didn't move, but his tail thumped once. Quiet. And sure. The road stretched long and quiet as they crossed into Oregon, skimming the edge of the Pacific under a cold, fading sun. Miles drove without music. Windows rolled halfway down to let the salt, heavy wind move through the truck. Blitz sat upright in the passenger seat, ears perked, nose twitching every few seconds, as if the scent of someone was pulling at a memory buried deep inside him. They had driven through the night, 3 states, dozens of towns. But this small, weathered seaside town was different. It was the end of the trail. Clara had called 2 nights earlier, her voice hushed but resolute. She'd tracked a sequence of veterinary visits across Arizona, then Idaho, and finally to a coastal town south of Coos Bay, Oregon. The patient details varied, but every record pointed to the same story: male Pitbull, gray coat, torn left ear, healed fracture in the rear leg, same walk, same wariness, same name each time different, only in how it was spoken: Ty, Ton, T. Each alias led closer to the truth. "Whoever's with him," Clara had said, "doesn't want to be found." Miles had only nodded and packed his things. He didn't know what he expected to find. Part of him thought maybe Blitz would lead the way, and in a way he did. The town was little more than a strip of fishing docks and sun-bleached storefronts. Locals moved like they had all the time in the world: old men pulling up crab pots, women hauling nets, boots soaked with brine and routine. There was a stillness here that felt earned. Miles stopped at the first place that looked open, an old vet clinic tucked between a bait shop and a laundromat. The woman behind the counter looked up at the mention of gray Pitbull and nodded slowly. "I think I saw one like that. Real quiet dog." Owner didn't give much info. "Paid in cash." She pointed toward the docks. "They come in once a week. Wood shop by the far end." Miles thanked her and stepped back into the cold. The moment they reached the pier, Blitz changed. He stopped walking. His body tensed. Then, without warning, he took off. Miles called after him, but Blitz didn't look back. His paws echoed against the old boards of the dock as he weaved between coiled ropes and stacked crates. Fishermen stepped aside, startled. Seagulls scattered overhead. Miles chased after him, breath quick, heart pounding. Blitz stopped in front of a narrow wooden structure at the edge of the harbor, a small workshop, tools stacked neatly along the walls, sawdust scattered across the floor just inside the open door. And standing in its shadow was a man. His back was hunched slightly, a gray hoodie pulled low over his face. His hands, rough and worn, held a chisel mid-motion, as if frozen in time. Blitz approached him slowly, tail low, body trembling not with fear, but with something deeper: recognition. The man looked up, and in that single glance, the years between them vanished. Blitz stepped forward and gently rested his head against the man's chest. The chisel dropped from his hand. The man fell to his knees, arms folding around the dog like a prayer come true, his body shaking as a low whisper escaped his cracked lips. "Titan." The name barely reached the air, but Blitz heard it. He didn't move. He didn't need to. Miles stood a few feet back, watching. He didn't need an introduction. This was Aiden Cross. The man the military said had died in the jungle, the man who'd vanished without a trace after the blast, the man Blitz had dragged through fire and smoke to safety. Aiden looked up, eyes rimmed red, face aged beyond his years. Scars crept from beneath his collar, one trailing along his left jaw, the other disappearing under his sleeve. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I thought he was gone." Miles nodded softly. "He thought you were too." Aiden sat down hard on the workshop step. Blitz pressed tightly into his side. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then the words began to come halting, broken but real. "There was no plan," he said. "After the explosion, everything changed. Command went dark. I knew too much. They tried to clean it up. I had to disappear." Miles listened quietly. "I moved from place to place, took jobs under fake names, but I kept him close, always, until they came for him, said he was property. I ran. We ran." He looked down at Blitz, brushing his hand along the torn ear. "I couldn't let them take him, not after what he did for me, not after everything we survived." Miles's throat tightened. "They're still looking, I know." For a while, they just sat there, two men shaped by trauma, a dog who had carried the weight of them both. The sun had started to set now, casting the water in gold. Seagulls cried in the distance. A light breeze swept in off the waves, carrying with it something rare, peace. Aiden exhaled slowly. "I didn't think anyone would ever find me." "Blitz did," Miles said, gently. "He never stopped." That night, they didn't go back to the motel. Miles stayed in the cabin behind the workshop with Aiden and Blitz. They talked in fragments about the past, about the mission, about the silence that followed. There were no full confessions, no need, just shared understanding. By the time Miles lay down on the cot in the back room, Blitz was curled up between them, and for the first time in a long time, nobody needed to keep watch. Because somehow, against all odds, what was broken had found its way back together. Spring arrived slowly in the coastal town, brushing the air with the scent of salt and soft wildflowers. The waves came gentler now, less like warnings, and more like memories returning home. In a clearing just beyond the docks, where the forest bowed to the ocean, stood a low, wide building made of reclaimed wood and quiet purpose. No sign out front, no corporate logo, just a simple name carved into driftwood, hanging above the door: The Second Call. It wasn't a clinic. It wasn't a shelter. It was a sanctuary, a place where veterans and working dogs, both bearing the weight of silent battles, could begin again. Aiden, Miles, and Clara had built it together. It began with an idea, shared in whispers over black coffee and long nights after Blitz found his way back to the man he saved. An idea born not out of ambition, but out of necessity. There were too many like them, men who returned from war with pieces missing, dogs discarded after duty ended, no longer useful. The system had places for soldiers, and it had places for dogs, but no one had built a place for both, not one that truly understood what it meant to carry ghosts. So they built it. They gutted the old mill behind the woodshop, rewired the roof, installed bunk spaces and therapy rooms, cleared out an acre for open play and quiet walks beneath the trees. Clara helped secure modest funding from local organizations. Miles handcrafted every bench, every bed frame. Aiden opened his notebook for the first time in 5 years and began sketching floor plans like he was designing a home instead of a facility. And Blitz? He became its heart. He greeted every new visitor at the door, not with barking or tricks, but with presence. That calm, quiet energy that had once helped Miles sleep through the night now did the same for others: combat medics, retired firefighters, a woman who had worked in disaster recovery and hadn't spoken in full sentences since the earthquake in Mexico. They all found themselves reaching for Blitz. Some would cry just from touching him. Others, like a little boy with burn scars across his chest and arms, would sit for hours with Blitz resting against his side. The boy once whispered to his mother, "He doesn't care what I look like." And he didn't. Blitz never flinched from trauma because he knew what it looked like. In the evenings, Aiden ran group sessions under the porch light, where people could talk if they wanted, or not. Miles spent mornings teaching woodworking to those who couldn't sit still but needed to create something. Clara organized community events, open days where children could come play, where local schools visited to learn not just about service animals, but about resilience. Word of the center spread not fast, not viral, but steady, like a ripple across a still pond. They began receiving letters, then donations, then volunteers. A retired Marine from Utah drove 12 hours to donate a van. A widow from Nevada sent in a box of blankets stitched by hand, each tagged with a name of someone she'd lost. Every item was accepted. Every person was welcomed. Blitz watched it all. He was older now, his muzzle gray, his steps slower, but he remained the same sentinel. At night, he still slept at the main door. During storms, he walked the halls, checking each room as if counting heads. No one told him to do it. No one needed to. One afternoon, Miles sat on the porch, watching a new dog, a shepherd mix, run through the trees with a young veteran named Jonah, who hadn't smiled in months. Clara walked out, handing Miles a small package. It was the first copy of his book. He turned it over in his hands. How a Dog Saved Us Twice by Miles Thorne. Inside, the dedication read, "For those who thought they were lost, and for the ones who found them anyway." They printed 1,000 copies, then another 1,000. They mailed them to VA hospitals, retirement homes, small-town libraries, schools, community shelters. They never asked for anything in return. Some weeks later, a teacher from a rural Texas school emailed them to say a student who never talked had asked to read his report aloud because it was about the dog that saves people, even when he's tired. In the main room of the second call hangs a framed photograph. It's not large, it's not fancy, but it holds more weight than any medal could. Aiden, Miles, and Blitz stand side by side, the ocean horizon behind them. Aiden's hand rests on Blitz's back. Miles's arm brushes against Aiden's. None of them are smiling, but their eyes tell a different story of quiet strength, of peace earned the hard way. Beneath the frame are the words etched in black. He didn't survive. He came back for all of us. That was Blitz. He wasn't a miracle. He was a bridge between what was broken and what could be rebuilt. And even as the seasons turned, as new faces arrived at the second call carrying their own stories and scars, Blitz remained watchful, present, unshaken, because some guardians don't need capes. They just need time, a place to rest, and a soul who sees them for more than what they've done. They need someone to answer. The second call, what began with silence, ended in legacy. Through one dog's loyalty, one man's courage, and one truth long buried, a sanctuary was born for those who gave everything, and those who came back, carrying the weight of what was lost. As Helen Keller once said, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Reaching 1,000 subscribers is not just a goal, it's a symbol of encouragement, a reason to continue creating meaningful stories. Leave us a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Miles's shoes? Or simply tell us, what does healing mean to you? Your voice matters here,